Number 1. The Etruscan Liber Linteus. In a museum in Zagreb, Croatia, there is the mummy of a woman, and the linen bandages wound around her body are covered in writing. For decades, no one could read a word of it. The script was not Egyptian. It belonged to a people the Romans had swallowed whole and then forgotten. This is the single largest surviving text in the Etruscan language, and it reached us wrapped around a corpse that had nothing to do with Etruria at all. The story begins in 1848. A Croatian official named Mihajlo Baric bought a mummy in Alexandria, Egypt as a travel souvenir. He propped it up in his home. When he died in 1859, the mummy passed to his brother, and in 1867 it was donated to the State Museum in Zagreb. The linen wrappings, dense with faded reddish-brown letters, were assumed to be Egyptian. Only in 1891 did the Egyptologist Heinrich Brugsch look closely and realize the truth. The writing was Etruscan. The Etruscans built the civilization that shaped early Rome. The toga came from them. So did the arch, the practice of reading omens, the staging of gladiatorial games, and much of Roman state religion. Yet almost none of their literature survives. Rome absorbed the culture and did not preserve its books. The Emperor Claudius wrote a 20-volume history of the Etruscans, and every page of it is lost. What survives instead is this, the Liber Linteus, the Linen Book of Zagreb. Radiocarbon dating places the linen at around 250 BCE, meaning the book was already old when it was cut into strips and reused to wrap the dead. The mummy herself has been identified as a woman named Nesi Hensu, the wife of a Theban tailor. She was Egyptian. The sacred Etruscan calendar bound around her was, to the embalmers, simply cloth. The text is a ritual almanac. It names gods, prescribes offerings, and fixes dates, a liturgical calendar of an Etruscan religious year. About 1,200 words remain legible, and even that is a treasure, because Etruscan is a language isolate with no close surviving relatives. Scholars can sound the words out because the Etruscans borrowed a Greek-derived alphabet, but the meanings resist us. Only a few hundred Etruscan words are firmly understood. Every clause parsed adds another entry to a painfully small dictionary. Why did this book survive when a whole literature vanished? The mainstream answer is pure accident. Linen was a genuine writing surface in the ancient Mediterranean, but organic cloth almost never lasts, so this specimen endures only because Egypt's dry climate and the act of reuse combined to protect it. A second reading is more mundane still. Egyptian embalmers bought cheap imported linen in bulk, and the script written on it was irrelevant to their purpose. A more speculative idea that the reuse points to an Etruscan presence in Ptolemaic Egypt has a little support. The likeliest truth is chance. And chance is the unsettling part. An entire literate civilization, one that taught Rome how to build and how to pray, survives in a single book we can barely read. The Etruscans wrote and copied and treasured their texts, and almost all of it is gone. What reaches us is a set of bandages that outlasted an empire. It is the first lesson of this list, that the past does not keep what mattered most. It keeps whatever the fire, the mud, and the accident of reuse happen to spare. Number 2, the Derveni Papyrus. In 1962, archaeologists digging a grave near Thessaloniki in northern Greece lifted a blackened lump out of the ashes of an ancient funeral pyre. It looked like a charred log. It was a book. This is the Derveni Papyrus, the oldest surviving manuscript in Europe, and the reason it exists at all is a paradox. It survived because it was set on fire. Papyrus is organic. In the wet soil of mainland Greece, it rots away within years. Nearly every Greek papyrus we possess comes from the dry sands of Egypt, but when this scroll was placed on a pyre alongside its owner, the flames did not consume it. They carbonized it, turning it to fragile carbon that could not decay. Conservators spent years separating the fused, brittle fragments, and about 26 columns of text are now readable, coaxed out with infrared and multispectral imaging that can distinguish black ink from black char. The content is extraordinary. The scroll is a commentary written around 340 BCE on a religious poem attributed to the mythical singer Orpheus. But the anonymous author does not read the poem literally. He reads it allegorically. The gods, he argues, are really physical and cosmic principles, air and mind and necessity governing an ordered universe. He engages with the early natural philosophers, the Atomists and Anaxagoras, and he quotes Heraclitus directly, preserving fragments of that philosopher that survive nowhere else. This is the birth of Western rational thought, caught in the act. The Derveni author stands exactly at the boundary between two ways of explaining the world. Behind him is mythos, the world explained through stories about gods. Ahead of him is logos, the world explained through principles and causes. He is trying to reconcile them, to keep the old sacred poem while decoding it into a new physics. In doing so, he performs one of the earliest recorded acts of interpretation, distinguishing what a text literally says from what he believes it truly means. Here the ground is genuinely contested, and it is worth pausing on. Scholars still argue about when the text was composed, who wrote it, and whether the author was a working priest of a mystery cult or a detached intellectual. Some have tried to attach a famous name, a sophist such as Diagoras or Stesimbrotus, but no attribution has stuck. The scroll guards its author's identity as stubbornly as it guarded its text under 4 decades of delay, because astonishingly, it was not fully and officially published until 2006, more than 40 years after it came out of the ground. The grave that held it was rich. Alongside the scroll lay a magnificent bronze mixing vessel, weapons, and gold, the burial of an elite, possibly an initiate of an Orphic mystery religion. That detail matters because it tells us that private individuals in 4th century BCE Macedonia owned, read, and were buried with heterodox intellectual literature. Philosophy was not confined to a few famous Athenians. It circulated, and it was treasured enough to carry into the grave. The stakes here are quiet but enormous. The roots of Western science, of the very idea that the universe runs on impersonal laws rather than divine whims, were being written down and privately cherished earlier and more widely than the surviving record usually lets us see. We know this for one reason only. A grieving family in Macedonia laid a scroll on a fire, and the fire, instead of destroying the book, made it immortal. Number 3, the Bakhshali Manuscript. In 1881, a farmer digging in a field near the village of Bakhshali, then in British India and now in Pakistan, struck something brittle in the soil. It was a bundle of birch bark, about 70 fragile leaves covered in mathematics. On those leaves is a single small mark, a solid dot, and that dot may be the most important symbol human beings ever invented. The dot is a placeholder for 0. It sits inside a place value number system, the same idea that lets the digit in the tens column mean something different from the digit in the units column. Without a symbol to hold an empty place, that whole system collapses. The Bakhshali manuscript is among the earliest physical evidence we have of this idea being written down. Just how early is a live and genuine controversy. In 2017, radiocarbon dating at Oxford's Bodleian Library produced a shock. The birchbark folios did not all date to the same time. Some fell between roughly 224 and 383 of the Common Era, others centuries later, in the 7th century, and others later still. If the oldest leaves are truly that ancient, the dot on them would predate the famous temple inscription at Gwalior, dated 876, long regarded as the oldest dated 0 in India. But here's the hinge that keeps mathematicians arguing. How can a single manuscript be centuries older in some of its leaves than in others? Some scholars suspect the bark was reused across generations, which muddies any claim to the oldest 0, and leaves the true age unresolved. There is a deeper distinction hiding in that dot. A placeholder 0 merely marks an empty column. It is not yet a number you can calculate with. The leap to 0 as a true quantity, something you can add, subtract, and reason about, is credited to the mathematician Brahmagupta, who around 628 gave formal rules for arithmetic with 0 and with negative numbers. The Bakhshali text even uses a distinctive cross-like mark to signal a negative quantity. From India, this new mathematics traveled. It reached the Islamic world, where the scholar Al-Khwarizmi described it around 820. His name, Latinized, gives us the word algorithm. From there, it entered Europe, carried in the 1202 treatise of Leonardo of Pisa, better known as Fibonacci, and over centuries it displaced the clumsy Roman numerals that had no 0 at all. Trace the consequences forward, and they are staggering. Place value notation, decimals, negative numbers, the calculus, and ultimately, the binary code that runs every computer on Earth all rest on the abstraction of 0. Other civilizations reached for the idea independently. Babylonian scribes used a placeholder, and the Maya used a shell-shaped glyph. But only the Indian 0 grew into the fully operable number that reorganized human quantitative thought. The manuscript itself has lived at the Bodleian since 1902, too fragile now for public display. It is anonymous, most likely a teaching manual or a merchant's calculation handbook, written in a northwestern Indian script called charade. Nothing about it looks momentous. It is bark and ink and worked examples about profit and loss. And that is the point worth carrying away. A symbol that underpins all of modern science, finance, and technology was pulled out of a field by a farmer with a spade. Had he dug a few feet to the left, one of the clearest early traces of humanity's most powerful abstraction might still be underground. Number 4. The Instructions of Shuruppak. Picture a scribe in southern Mesopotamia more than 4,500 years ago, pressing a cut reed into wet clay. He is not recording a shipment of grain or a tax. He is writing down advice. A father speaking to his son. This is the Instructions of Shuruppak, and it is among the oldest works of literature on Earth, from a moment when humanity first began to write not just what it owned, but what it valued. The oldest copies come from the site of Abu Salabik in Iraq, and date to around 2600 BCE, the early dynastic period. The text is framed as the counsel of Shuruppak, son of Ubaratutu, to his son. And the son's name is significant. He is Ziusudri, the Sumerian hero of the Great Flood, the distant ancestor of the biblical Noah. The wisdom of this text is woven, from the very start, into the deep time flood tradition of Mesopotamia. The content is a string of maxims, practical and moral at once. Do not steal. Do not commit adultery. Do not stand as guarantor for another man's debt, for it will ruin you. Do not speak idly. Some lines are strikingly blunt, warnings against theft that end with warnings against harming yourself. Others are simply shrewd advice about property and reputation and trust. Together they form a portrait of an early urban society working out the rules that hold a city together. That father-to-son form became a template. It echoes forward through the instruction literature of Egypt and reaches, more than 1,500 years later, into the biblical books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. Several maxims in Shuruppak have close parallels in Proverbs, evidence of a shared stream of Near Eastern wisdom flowing across cultures and centuries. When you read a proverb today, you are drinking from a spring that first surfaced on clay in the 3rd millennium BCE. The text was written in cuneiform, the wedge-shaped script pressed into clay tablets, one of the world's first 2 full writing systems alongside Egyptian hieroglyphs. And its survival is a lesson in materials. Clay does not burn away like papyrus or rot like linen. Fire bakes it harder. Buried in the ground, a clay tablet can outlast every empire that ever ruled above it. That is why Mesopotamia gives us so much of the oldest writing. The scribal schools called the tablet houses copied texts like this one as teaching exercises, which is why so many duplicate copies survive across more than 1,000 years of use. How should we read it? The mainstream view treats it as a genuine early dynastic compilation of wisdom, real advice, really taught. A more literary reading sees Shuruppak less as a historical author than as an idealized ancestral voice, wisdom given the authority of a name and a city, for Shuruppak was also a real Sumerian town, Tel Farah, itself tied in tradition to the flood. A comparative reading places it at the head of an entire genre, the direct ancestor of the moral instruction that would shape Jewish, Christian, and Islamic thought. The weight of this small tablet is easy to miss. Long before the pyramids held their funeral texts, before the Torah, before any of the scriptures a large share of humanity now lives by, someone decided that values were worth preserving in writing, that a warning against injustice deserved to outlast the man who spoke it. The entire written conscience of civilization has a beginning, and this clay is very close to it. Number 5. The Dresden Codex. In the town of Mani in the Yucatan in 1562, a Spanish bishop named Diego de Landa built a bonfire out of books. He burned the written records of the Maya, hundreds of years of astronomy, prophecy, and history. And he later wrote that the Maya regretted the loss to an amazing degree, and that it caused them much affliction. From an entire civilization's library, only 4 books are known to survive. The oldest of them is the Dresden Codex. It is a thing of beauty. A screenfold book made of bark paper, coated in fine lime plaster, folded like an accordion into 39 leaves painted on both sides in red, black, and blue, stretching about 3.5 meters when opened out. It dates to the 11th or 12th century of the Common Era, though it almost certainly copies content from far older classic Maya sources now lost. The Codex is a work of hard science. It contains astronomical tables that track the planet Venus across its 584-day cycle, correcting for the small errors that accumulate over decades of observation. It carries eclipse tables that let Maya priests predict when the sun and moon would darken. All of it is tied to the interlocking Maya calendars, the 260-day sacred round, and the 365-day solar year. This is naked eye astronomy, gathered over generations, and its accuracy rivals anything in the contemporary Old World. It also proves something the Spanish tried to erase. The Maya independently invented a complete writing system, a positional mathematics, and a symbol for zero, a shell-shaped glyph. One of the very few times in human history that a positional zero was invented from scratch. A whole civilization in the Americas reached the same intellectual heights as Mesopotamia and Egypt entirely on its own. The survival of this particular book is a chain of near misses. It reached Europe before the worst of the burnings, and it was bought for the Royal Library in Dresden in 1739 from a private owner in Vienna. Then it nearly died a second time. When Dresden was firebombed in 1945, water damage stained and marred the codex, and parts of it were lost. Reading it took a revolution of its own. For a long time, scholars believed Maya glyphs were purely pictures. In the 1950s, a Soviet linguist named Yuri Knorozov showed that the script was partly phonetic, a syllabary that spelled out sounds, and that insight cracked the code of Maya writing open. The decipherment of Maya script is one of the great intellectual achievements of the 20th century, and this codex was central to it. There are competing ways to understand the book. The mainstream view is that it was a working almanac used by priests to schedule ritual against the movements of the sky. An archaeological reading stresses that it copies vanished classic-era originals, making it a survivor of a survivor. And a speculative strand tying its calendar cycles to modern doomsday myths about the end of the Maya calendar has been firmly rejected by scholars who actually read it. What lingers is the arithmetic of loss. An entire civilization's written mind, its astronomy, and its faith survives in essentially 4 books, and this is the oldest. Delanda's fire came within a few volumes of erasing the intellectual memory of an entire hemisphere. We remember the Maya as thinkers only because a handful of their books slipped across an ocean before the flames. Number 6. The Oracle Bones of Shang, China. More than 3,000 years ago, in the court of the Shang kings, a diviner heated a bronze point and pressed it against the polished underside of a turtle shell. The shell cracked with a sharp sound, and the pattern of that crack was read as an answer from the ancestors. Then, beside the crack, someone carved the question in words. Those carved questions are the earliest confirmed Chinese writing, and they are the direct ancestors of a script that more than 1 billion people read today. They are called the Oracle Bones, and the writing on them is Jiaguan, shell and bone writing, from roughly 1250 to 1050 BCE. The Shang used turtle shells and the flat shoulder blades of oxen for divination by fire. Around the heat cracks, they recorded the question put to the gods, the name of the diviner, the date, and sometimes the outcome. Through those inscriptions, we hear the anxieties of a Bronze Age court directly. Will the harvest succeed? Will it rain? Should the king go to war? Will the queen's childbirth go well? Will the sacrifice please the ancestors? The way they came back to light is one of the strangest turns in the history of writing. For years, farmers near Anyang had been digging up inscribed bones and selling them to apothecaries, where they were ground into powder and sold as dragon bones, a traditional medicine. An unknown quantity of the oldest Chinese writing was literally consumed as a remedy. Then, in 1899, a scholar named Wang Yirong, ill and examining a batch of these dragon bones, recognized the marks on them as an archaic form of Chinese script. The bones stopped being medicine and became history. Tens of thousands of inscribed pieces have since been recovered, chiefly from Yinshu, the ruins of the last Shang capital near modern Anyang. Systematic excavation began in 1928. The script contains several thousand distinct characters, of which more than 1,000 have been confidently deciphered. And it already shows the underlying logic of Chinese writing today, its pictures, its ideas, and its combined sound and meaning signs. The bones did something no other source could. They confirmed that the Shang dynasty was real. Before their discovery, the Shang were known mainly from the records of the Grand Historian, written by Sima Qian around 1,000 years after the dynasty fell. Skeptics doubted such a distant memory, but the names of the Shang kings carved on the oracle bones match Sima Qian's king list almost exactly, proving that a text written a millennium after the events had preserved real history. They also open a window onto a world of the dead. The Shang consulted their deceased kings as intermediaries to a high god called Die, a state religion built on ancestor worship. The same bones sometimes record large-scale human and animal sacrifice, the darker machinery of that faith. The mainstream view treats the corpus as a royal divination archive. To paleographers, it is the deliberate origin point of the Chinese writing system. A more speculative view holds that earlier writing existed on perishable materials and simply rotted away, leaving the bones as the oldest survivors rather than the true beginning. The weight of it is this. Of all the ancient writing systems, Egyptian, Sumerian, and the rest, Chinese is the only one still in continuous use. The script a billion people read, type, and text in today traces an unbroken line back to a diviner cracking a turtle shell to ask the dead about the weather. Writing here was born fused to religion and to the state, and that fusion became the backbone of the longest literate tradition on Earth. Number 7. The Epic of Gilgamesh. In 1872, in a back room of the British Museum, a self-taught scholar named George Smith was reading a broken clay tablet covered in cuneiform. As he worked through the wedge-shaped signs, he realized he was reading a story of a great flood, of a man told to build a boat and save the seed of all living things, of a dove released to find dry land. It was Noah, but it was older than the Bible. According to a colleague, Smith grew so excited that he leapt up and began tearing off his clothes in the museum. He had just found proof that one of the most sacred stories in Western civilization had far deeper roots. The tablet belonged to the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest great works of literature. It grew out of older Sumerian poems about Gilgamesh, the legendary king of Uruk, later woven into a unified Akkadian epic across 12 clay tablets. The standard version is attributed to a scribe and priest named Sin Leki Unini from around the 12th century BCE. The finest copies came from the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, assembled in the 7th century BCE and dug out of the earth in the 1850s. Smith announced his discovery in December of 1872 to the Society of Biblical Archaeology at a lecture the Prime Minister William Gladstone reportedly attended. The flood tablet was incomplete, and a London newspaper funded Smith to travel to Nineveh and search for the missing pieces. Remarkably, he found them. In the epic, the god Eo warns a man named Utnapishtim to build a great vessel and load it with living things before a divine deluge drowns humanity. Utnapishtim releases a dove, a swallow, and a raven to find land, the same sequence of birds later attributed to Noah. The implications shook Victorian Britain. If the biblical flood drew on a Mesopotamian story centuries older, then Genesis was not the first word on the matter, but a late voice in a long tradition. And that tradition ran deeper still. The Mesopotamian flood story itself descends from earlier Sumerian sources, from the flood hero Ziusudra, the very son addressed in the Instructions of Shuruppak. The books on this list are not separate. They are branches of one deep river. Gilgamesh is far more than a flood. At its heart, it is about death. When the wild man Enkidu, Gilgamesh's beloved friend, dies, the king is seized by terror at his own mortality. He journeys to the ends of the earth to find Utnapishtim and the secret of eternal life, and he fails. That meditation on grief, friendship, fame, and the limits of human power makes the epic a foundational text of world literature written more than 1,000 years before Homer. The tablet survived by the same brutal logic we keep meeting. When Nineveh was sacked and burned, the fire that destroyed the palaces baked the clay library hard, preserving the tablets in the ruins for 2,500 years. To read them at all required first cracking cuneiform, a feat achieved in the mid-19th century, in large part through Henry Rawlinson's decoding of the great trilingual inscription at Behistun. scholars still debate what stands behind the flood. The mainstream view is an independent Mesopotamian tradition older than Genesis. A religious historical reading sees a shared memory of real, catastrophic floods on the Tigris and Euphrates. A more speculative view imagines a single historical deluge behind every version, which remains unproven. What is certain is that a buried clay library, pulled from the sand, rewrote how humanity understood the origins of its own oldest sacred stories. New fragments still surface. As recently as 2015, newly identified lines expanded the epic's description of the cedar forest. The oldest story is not finished being found. Number 8. The Egyptian Book of the Dead. A scribe named Ani stands in a great hall and his heart is being weighed on a scale. On the other pan rests a single feather. Around him wait the gods of the dead. And beneath the balance crouches a monster. Part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, ready to devour him if the scale tips wrong. This scene, painted more than 3,000 years ago, is the most famous image from the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And it may be the oldest vivid picture of the idea that the soul is judged after death. The Egyptians did not call it the Book of the Dead. Their name was the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It was not a single fixed scripture, but a customizable collection of nearly 200 spells copied onto papyrus and buried with the dead to guide them through the dangers of the afterlife. The most celebrated copy, the Papyrus of Ani, was made around 1250 BCE for the scribe Ani and his wife Tutu. It runs about 24 meters long, a masterpiece of illustration, and it was acquired for the British Museum in 1888 by E. A. Wallace Budge, who controversially cut the long scroll into sections to transport it. The tradition reaches back much further. Its ancestors are the pyramid texts, carved inside royal pyramids from around 2400 BCE and the later coffin texts. And its history contains a quiet revolution. The earliest afterlife spells were reserved for kings painted on the walls of pyramids. Over time, on cheaper papyrus, they became available to anyone who could afford a copy. The Book of the Dead democratized eternity. A scribe like Ani could buy the same passage through death that had once belonged only to a pharaoh. At the center of it all is the weighing of the heart. The dead person's heart is balanced against the feather of Mot, the goddess of truth and cosmic order, before the god Osiris. If the heart is heavy with wrongdoing, the devourer, Ammit, eats it, and the soul is annihilated. To pass, the deceased recites the negative confession, spell 125, a long list of sins declared undone. I have not stolen. I have not killed. I have not lied. It is one of the earliest codified moral standards tied directly to judgment after death. The book blends magic and religion, knowing the correct spells and the secret names of the gates, guardians, and demons of the underworld was believed to guarantee safe passage. The illustrations effectively map the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, its hazards and gates, a guidebook to the geography of death. Because scribes personalized each copy with the owner's name, we know the individuals these papyri were made for, people like Ani, Hunefer, and Nu, whose names survive because they paid to be remembered. How we read it depends on the angle. The mainstream view treats it as a piece of spiritual technology, a set of tools engineered to defeat death. A religious historical reading emphasizes its moral core, the judgment of the soul against a standard of truth. An idea that rippled outward into later Mediterranean beliefs about the afterlife. A more speculative claim that it directly shaped Christian and Islamic images of divine judgment is debated, since influence across 1,000 years is hard to prove. The papyri survive because of Egypt's dry air, which preserves organic papyrus that would rot almost anywhere else. And what they preserve is nothing less than a template for how much of humanity still imagines death, a soul standing before a scale, its worth measured against truth, its fate hanging on the balance. Number 9. The Code of Hammurabi. In a gallery of the Louvre stands a pillar of black stone, more than 7 feet tall, carved from top to bottom in cuneiform. At its summit, a relief shows a king standing before a seated god. The god is Shamash, the sun and the divine judge, and he is handing the king a rod and a ring, the symbols of authority and just measure. Below that image run nearly 300 laws. This is the Code of Hammurabi, and it is one of the oldest attempts humanity ever made to write justice down and put it above the whim of any single ruler. Hammurabi was the king of Babylon, who reigned from around 1792 to 1750 BCE and unified much of Mesopotamia under his rule. His code was inscribed on this basalt stele, roughly 2¼ meters of dense Akkadian text, and the reason we have it intact is another accident of conquest. Around 1150 BCE, an Elamite king named Shutruk-Nahunte carried the stele off to Susa, in what is now Iran, as war booty. It was found there in 1901 by a French team, 6 centuries, and a full country, removed from where it was made. The laws themselves are framed as case rulings. If a man does this, then that shall follow. The code is famous for the principle of retaliation, an eye for an eye. If a man destroys the eye of another, his own eye shall be destroyed. But the punishments were not equal for all. They were graded sharply by social class. Harm done to a nobleman carried heavier penalties than the same harm done to a commoner or an enslaved person. Justice was written down, but it was written unequal. The scope is remarkable. The code covers trade, debt, property, inheritance, marriage, wages, farming, and crime. It even regulates professions. A surgeon whose patient dies under the knife could have his hand cut off. Physicians' fees are set by the class of the patient. This is a whole society 3,700 years ago trying to fix the rules of daily life in stone. It was not the first law code. Earlier Mesopotamian codes exist, the Code of Ur-Nammu from around 2100 BCE and the laws of Eshnunna and Lipit Ishtar. But Hammurabi's is the most complete and the most famous, and its prologue makes its purpose ringingly clear. The king was appointed, it says, to cause justice to prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. Scholars disagree about how it actually worked. The mainstream view long held it to be enforced statute law, the operating code of an empire. But a strong scholarly reading argues it functioned more as royal propaganda, an idealized monument advertising the king's justice, since surviving court records rarely cite it directly. A comparative reading places it in a shared Near Eastern legal stream, one that shows striking structural parallels with later biblical law, such as the Covenant Code in the Book of Exodus. Whatever its precise force in a Babylonian courtroom, the idea carved into that black stone changed everything that came after. Law should be written, law should be public, displayed where people can see it, and law should stand above the individual so that not even a king can simply invent the rules as he goes. Every constitution written since is a distant descendant of a pillar, a conqueror, once dragged across the desert as loot. Number 10. The Dead Sea Scrolls. In 1947, a Bedouin shepherd was throwing stones into the mouth of a cliff cave near the Dead Sea, and he heard one of them shatter pottery inside. When he and his companions climbed up to look, they found tall clay jars, and inside the jars were scrolls, wrapped and hidden and untouched for 2,000 years. They had stumbled onto the most important manuscript discovery of the 20th century, the Dead Sea Scrolls. Between 1947 and 1956, around 900 to 1,000 manuscripts were recovered from 11 caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran. The dry desert air and the sealed jars had preserved them across the centuries. They date from roughly the 3rd century BCE to the 1st century of the Common Era, the world of Second Temple Judaism, the very era in which both Rabbinic Judaism and Christianity took shape. Their importance is hard to overstate. They include the oldest surviving manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible, roughly 1,000 years older than the medieval codices that had been our best text before. The Great Isaiah Scroll, nearly complete, is the showpiece. And when scholars compared it to the medieval Masoretic text of Isaiah, they found it remarkably close, powerful evidence that the biblical text had been copied with extraordinary stability across a full millennium. Fragments of every book of the Hebrew Bible except the Book of Esther have been identified among the scrolls. The scrolls are not only biblical, they fall into 3 broad groups: biblical texts, other religious writings, and the rule books of a community, written mostly in Hebrew, with some in Aramaic and Greek. They include previously unknown psalms, verse-by-verse commentaries on scripture, calendar texts, and a community rulebook sometimes called the Manual of Discipline. Together, they reveal a Judaism far more diverse and contested than the later, standardized tradition suggests. Who wrote them is genuinely unsettled. The traditional view links the scrolls to the Essenes, an ascetic Jewish sect thought to have lived at Qumran, but an alternative reading holds that the scrolls were a library evacuated from Jerusalem and hidden in the caves before the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 of the Common Era. A third view sees several unrelated deposits made over time. The debate is far from closed. Cave 4 alone yielded some 15,000 fragments from hundreds of different manuscripts, a jigsaw puzzle scholars are still assembling. One scroll stands apart from all the others. The copper scroll, engraved not on parchment but on metal, is a list of hidden caches of gold and silver. No one has ever found the treasure it describes, and its purpose remains a mystery. And the modern history of the scrolls has its own drama. Access to them was tightly controlled for decades, provoking a bitter academic scandal until fuller publication was finally forced in the early 1990s. Today, radiocarbon dating and the study of ancient handwriting confirm their age, while multispectral imaging and even DNA analysis of the animal skin parchment help scholars match fragment to fragment. What the scrolls accomplished is simple to state and staggering to absorb. They pushed the manuscript foundation of the Hebrew Bible back a full 1,000 years, and they showed the sacred text of a third of the planet as it stood before. It was ever standardized, alive, varied, and being argued over, in the decades when Western religion was being born. Look back across these 10 books and a pattern emerges, and it is a disquieting one. They did not survive because anyone carefully protected them. They survived by accident, and always through the same narrow set of physical flukes. Fire preserved the Derveni scroll by turning it to carbon, and fire baked the clay libraries of Gilgamesh and Nineveh hard enough to last millennia. Clay and stone are the great survivors, which is why the Instructions of Shuruppak and the Code of Hammurabi reach us while so much else is gone. Dry air saved the papyrus of the Book of the Dead and the parchment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Reuse saved the Etruscan Liber Linteus, burial in jars saved the scrolls, and simple burial in a field hid the Bakhshali bark until a farmer's spade found it. Against all of that stands the counterforce, deliberate destruction. Bishop Delanda's bonfires came within a few volumes of erasing the entire written mind of the Maya, and that is the sobering truth beneath this whole list. What we have is a biased sample. The books that survive are not the ones that mattered most. They are the ones the fire, the mud, the desert, and blind luck happened to spare. Whole literatures are simply gone. The Etruscans wrote libraries and we can barely read one book. The Maya wrote a civilization's worth of astronomy and prophecy, and 4 books remain. Yet look at what these accidental survivors carry. Writing itself was invented independently at least 4 times, in Mesopotamia, in Egypt, in China, and in the Americas. The symbol for 0 was invented independently in India, in Babylon, and among the Maya, though only India's grew into the number that runs every computer. These books encode the largest leaps our species ever made, law written down and made public. The idea of moral judgment after death, mathematics with a 0, predictive astronomy, the birth of philosophy, the first wisdom set into words. Each one bent the path of a civilization, and several bent the path of all humanity. And reading them back required a second kind of heroism, the decipherers. George Smith reconstructing a flood from broken cuneiform, Yuri Narazov cracking the Maya glyphs, Henry Rawlinson scaling a cliff to copy the inscription that unlocked cuneiform. Without them, these survivors would still be silent objects. The marks endured by luck, the meaning was recovered by obsession. And still, so much stays out of reach. The Etruscan language is only partly readable, and the Liber Linteus keeps most of its secrets. The true age of the Bakhshali manuscript remains genuinely unresolved, its 0 hovering between the 3rd century and the 9th. The author of the Derveni Papyrus is still anonymous. The gold of the copper scroll has never been found. And the question of who hid the Dead Sea Scrolls, a desert sect or a fleeing city, has never been settled. Behind these 10 survivors loomed the ghosts of everything lost. The libraries of Alexandria, the burned corpus of the Maya, Claudius's 20-volume history of the Etruscans. We cannot even estimate how much early writing existed on materials that simply rotted, leaving no trace at all. And the record is not closed. New fragments of Gilgamesh are still being identified, so even the oldest story is not yet whole. Artificial intelligence and new imaging are now reading the carbonized scrolls of Herculaneum buried by Vesuvius, words no human has seen in nearly 2,000 years. The frontier of recovery is still moving. The pattern all of this suggests is humbling. We have read only a sliver of what humanity once wrote. These 10 books, the linen and the clay, the bark and the bone, the papyrus and the parchment, are the visible tips of a drowned continent of human thought. They are proof of how much brilliance the past produced and proof of how nearly all of it we have lost. Across deep time, remembering anything at all turns out to be the rarest miracle of all. If the deep past still has questions for you, there's another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.